Hello, in this video I'll be showing you how to harvest and dry fresh basil. Before I start to harvest any of my basil, I always look through the plant first to see if there's any leaves that I need to prune. To do this, I'm checking for leaves that have turned yellow or even brown if they've started to die. I want to remove these leaves first because regardless of how much I'm taking either through pruning or harvesting, I never want to remove more than 1/3 of the basil plant because this can actually kill the plant. So I start by pruning off any leaves or areas that look like they're dead or dying to make sure that the plant is putting most of its energy to making good leaves. And then I'll move on to harvesting. If I'm only taking a couple basil leaves for garnishing on a dish, I'll just pinch the couple leaves off right at the base. But this isn't recommended if you're doing a larger harvest for drying or for making a pesto or some recipe that calls for more basil because it can actually stunt the growth of your plant. So when I'm doing a larger harvest, I will cut the stem of the plant. I cut this right above the separation of two different stems on the plant to make sure that it encourages new growth after this has been removed. I harvested this basil to create dried basil. I find that basil that I dry myself keeps a much stronger flavor than any of the dried basil that I've bought from the stores. This is probably because it's a much fresher dried basil. Here I'm using some egg crate light diffuser to hold the basil up. I gently thread some of the leaves from the basil stem up through the square and use this as a support for the plant so the rest of it hangs down vertically. I repeat this with all of the different stems that I've harvested from my basil plant. You can see that I'm splitting some of the stems into smaller sections. This allows me to create more spacing between the leaves, which in turn allows the leaves to dry better. Once I have all of the basil stems hung up, I'm going to let them dry for 2 to 3 weeks. I find that basil takes longer to fully dry than some of the other herbs that I've harvested. This is due to the size of the leaves and due to the amount of moisture content that's in each leaf. Here you can see what the basil leaves look like after they've been fully dried. It's really important to make sure that the basil leaves are fully dried before you grind them up and store them, because if there's any moisture left, it can create mold, which is definitely not food safe. Now that I have all the dried basil collected, I break the leaves off of the stems. I do this over a bowl to make it easier to put this in a container when I'm done. You could use a mortar and pestle or a food processor to grind the basil leaves up even smaller, but I'm just using my hands because I kind of like a larger piece of dried basil. Another reason that I don't grind the basil really small right now is because I can always make it smaller later when I'm going to add it into a recipe. But the smaller the basil is, the more surface exposure it has, and this is what causes the basil to lose its potency. So the basil will last longer in the larger pieces that you have it in. I try not to break up any of the stems and drop them into the bowl with the basil, but if I do accidentally drop one in there, I make sure to pick it out because you don't want to have the basil stem in any of the recipes that you make with your dried basil. Now that I have all the basil separated from the stem, I move it into my food storage container. You can use any container here that you can get a tight seal on. I'm using an old spice container because I know that this works for previous spices that had been in it. Basil doesn't necessarily expire, it will just lose its potency, so you can keep this in your pantry for up to or even over a year. You can check if your basil is still good by smelling it, and if it still smells like basil, it's okay to use in your recipes. Thanks for watching this video on how to harvest and dry basil. Let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.